something that stuck with me about the way that we worked with each other was that we always said, and this is more like, okay, somebody wants to do something, right? And rather than shutting them down and saying like, no, that's not what we're going to do, we did a really good job of keeping in mind the mantra of just say yes. If you can say yes, do say yes.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indie Author Podcast, I talk with Todd Fahnestock about navigating collaborative storytelling, including the intricacies and benefits of collaborative writing, the flexibility required for successful collaborations, the dynamics of sharing creative control, and the emotional impact when projects don't meet expectations. He details the guidelines his collaborators in the ELDROS Legacy series established to maintain world consistency, and the importance of a just say yes approach to foster creativity. And now let's hear from Todd Fahnestock about navigating collaborative storytelling. Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Todd Fahnestock. Hey, Todd, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks so much for having me on the show again.
I am happy to have you back, and to give a little background for anyone who missed that earlier episode. Todd Fahnestock is an award-winning #1 best-selling author of fantasy for all ages and winner of the New York Public Library's Books for the Teen Age Award. He is the author of the epic fantasy series Threadweavers and the Whisper Prince trilogy, and the multi-author shared world fantasy series ELDROS Legacy. He is a 3-time winner of the Colorado Authors League Award for Writing Excellence and a 2-time finalist for the Colorado Book Award for Tower of the Four, and his passions are great stories and his quirky, fun-loving family. And Todd joined me earlier for episode 224, Secrets of Maximizing In-Person Sales. And I have to say that one of my favorite moments of the podcast, just in general, was when you gave your book table pitch for your book as you would give it to a person. That was just so much fun. And I think anyone, whether they're looking to do in-person sales or not, would benefit from going back and checking that out. So episode 224, that's the other one to check out.
That was definitely the part that I was most practiced at. I think that pitch I had probably given like 800 times, whereas the rest of the podcast, I was just making it up as I went along. So probably why that came off so well.
You're a true pro because it didn't sound like you had done it 1,000 times before. It sounded like the first time.
That's a good thing,
yeah,
right?
That's the other pro tip there that people can learn from you. So I invited Todd back on the podcast because we were both in a story bundle together, and I saw that Todd's book was in there called Falling to Fly. And I checked it out. I was reading through it, and I thought there's tons of good information here. In Falling to Fly, one of the things you talked about was various collaborations you had through your career, some of which turned out great, and some of which maybe didn't turn out quite so great. And so I think you're obviously a person who likes to reach out and connect with people. So can you just talk about what role collaboration has played for you, and what were the differences between those two experiences that you had with different kinds of collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been collaborating in a way. I mean, like, so I'll go way back to like high school when I was living with this friend of mine, and we would role play all the time, right? So in the role playing, that's when I came up with the idea for Metafe, who is the wild main character, which is the titular character of the first book, Wild Mane, in the Threadweaver series, right? And because we were role playing, that's how I came up with that book. So that, I would say, the earliest collaboration that came from that. And he and I actually started writing a book together back then that was 1,400 years before the book that became Wild Mane, that became that first book in the series. And it didn't go very far. I think we had 13 chapters out of 60 or whatever in it. And it just sort of fizzled and we went our separate ways. But so that was like the beginnings of collaboration, where there was no commitment. There was nothing on the line. It was just pure fun. Friends kind of making stuff up and putting it down on paper. And then I think the collaboration that you're talking about, or at least one of the major collaborations that you're talking about, is the Hearthstone trilogy, which Giles Carlin and I got together and we started writing this book. And it ended up being a trilogy that got picked up by HarperCollins, their EOS fantasy imprint, which I'm not even sure if that imprint exists anymore. But it was HarperCollins that published us in, and it started out like a dream. It started off, I mean, what I would have to say about collaborations in general before I kind of go into the details is that every collaboration I've had has been amazing at certain parts and really hard at certain other parts. And I would have to say, I mean, probably overall, sum total, it's going to be more work than you think it is for sure. And it might be more work than actually doing the book by yourself. That's the truth. But you get things you wouldn't get just by yourself. So there's lots of benefits. There's some detriments. But that first collaboration, like, we just flew. In the beginning, it was like having fun with my best friend, playing Dungeons and Dragons with my best friend, and we were coming up with this book. Then in the subsequent drafts, it got hard because he wanted to cut certain things. I wanted to keep certain things, or I wanted to cut certain things and he wanted to keep certain things, and he wanted to go this way. I wanted to go that way. And there were a lot of conversations. I won't call them fights, but they were fights. So there were a lot of arguments about that. And as I said in the book, by the time we got done with that trilogy, we completed the whole trilogy, went out into the world, and it did not sell to expectation. This is one of my stories in the book. And one of the main reasons that it's called Falling to Fly, because I fall on my face a lot in this book. If you ever felt like you tried to hit the mark and you missed, again, this is like a great compendium of all the places that I completely screwed up and backtracked and tried to get back on track. I mean, and that was one of them where we got this big publisher, we got the big agent, they auctioned it off in New York, and we had all of the earmarks for a career that was just going to take off to the moon. And it didn't sell to expectation, and they dropped us. And that was pretty much my first descent into, okay, now I'm back in Gen Pop and I got to fight my way out again, right? I'm back at the base level and I got to find another deal.
Oh, can I ask you a question about that though? Because the situation was kind of taken care of for you because you were running into these tensions, and then it went away because the publisher pulled out, right? But if it had sold really well, do you have thoughts about, would you have gone ahead with it? Would you have approached it differently? What kind of learnings would you have taken if there was a request for more books from you?
Yeah. I mean, that is a question I ask myself often because it became a huge struggle towards the end. There was a lot of like, you're not pulling your weight. No, you're not pulling your weight. I mean, things like that were starting to come up, not great things, right? And who was contributing more, and a lot of those discussions were already happening. And so the universe moves in strange ways sometimes. And I sometimes wonder if it was a blessing in disguise that we didn't end up becoming super popular with that particular series, because I don't think those things would have gone away. I think they would have become exacerbated. Now, there's another side where I think, okay, maybe the reason that we started having strife was because we feared that it wasn't selling to expectation. We feared that even by the second book, we might have known that, the first one didn't go gangbusters, and we were already feeling like, I wonder if it's just a slow starter or whatever. And maybe that's what caused some of that anxiety and caused some of that, well, who isn't doing what they need to be doing in order for this to succeed? But I doubt it. Like my thought is success or failure. One of the things that I've noticed about success is it tends to exacerbate the problems that are already there. Like you think it's going to solve all the problems, but it doesn't. It actually exacerbates the demons that are already alive and well in your head. And I think if that had continued forward, like you said, if it had been a runaway success, so here's an interesting timeline thing for you. So we came out with Heir of Autumn in the same year that Brandon Sanderson came out with Elantris. Just to give you an idea, they were sort of side by side in that time frame, right? And of course, Brandon Sanderson is now Brandon Sanderson. And so his definitely did take off. So I'm just wondering if Heir of Autumn and the Hearthstone trilogy had taken off like we had thought it would, then I think Giles and I would have been pretty much handcuffed to each other for a good long while. And so whatever problems we had collaborating together would have been our lot in life. That would have been the definition of our career. And had we broken up like some kind of boy band that has like 2 great albums, and then all of a sudden they all go and have their solo careers that nobody remembers any of them, except for Justin Timberlake. I guess he did rise above the crowd. But they're not the same, right? And that's not what people signed up for. So it does matter, I think, what you build the base of your career with, because if you do get a big success, that's your career. That's where you got to stay and work for the rest of your life, or for however long that career is staying at that height. So, I mean, maybe that's sour grapes because it didn't work out, and it would have been really cool if that particular story had worked out, or maybe it's actually seeing the truth of it, that that maybe it matters how you build your base, and you want it to be something that brings you joy every day. And writing is the hardest job I've ever had. And I've had a lot of jobs that if you read Falling to Fly, you'll realize just how many jobs I've had in my lifetime. And this is the hardest by far that I've ever had, but it's also the most rewarding. And so having that cycle where you are so rewarded for all the effort that you put in is the cycle you want to be in. And in collaboration, sometimes it's difficulty of writing plus all the personalities that are at odds with each other about this, that, or the other thing. And so that's extra weight that you have to deal with. And sometimes it's too much weight to bear. Sometimes it can pull you down. But like I said, on the flip side, sometimes you come up with stuff that is just amazing. And moving into the second collaboration that I was talking about, ELDROS Legacy, that's what happened there, where we just came up with some really cool stuff that made this world so expansive and so interesting and so has so many details. And the ELDROS Legacy just took off and was just such a great story.
And is that a scenario? Is it logistically different in the sense that it sounds like for your first collaboration, it was the two of you working on one story, but is the ELDROS Legacy, is it people writing in individual stories, or just describe a little bit what that what that is?
The ELDROS Legacy is a multi-author shared world experience that is like this epic, mega epic fantasy story. And there are 5 continents on the world of ELDROS. There's Noxanon, Lathranon, Draconon, Pyranon, and Daemonon, right? And each continent was founded eons ago, thousands of years ago, by different giant tribes. And they went to war with each other when they essentially came to this world, and then split into 4 different tribes: the Pyranoi, the Draconoi, the Daemonoi, and the Noxanoi. And they all went to their various continents and built their civilizations, and they went to various wars with each other. So the giants are immortal. You can kill them by violence, but like Tolkien's elves, they live forever if you don't kill them by violence. And they created these mortal races, or about half of the mortal races. Well, these mortal races rose up and overthrew the giants long ago because one of the giants turned traitor and taught them how to use magic. So with that extra advantage of magic, they were able to overthrow their overlords. And the story starts, at least my story in Legacy of Shadows, starts 2,000 years after that. Mine is on Noxanon and follows these 5 characters that have to get engaged with this meta plot to eventually defeat the giants. And so the same thing happens on Daemonon with Quincy's characters, on Draconon with Mark's characters, and on Pyranon with Marie's characters. We were talking about Marie before. That's that same Marie that works with Kevin J. Anderson a lot. And so that's how it came together. And the notion is that once we get to book 5, our personal stories will kind of finish out and then graduate into this Avengers series of stories where all of these characters, or at least a certain part of each of these characters, will come together. And that was the plan from the very beginning that we started back in 2021. At this point, I've got my story finished in Noxanon, and I'm a little bit of a faster writer than some of the other authors in the world. So they've each got one or two books out in each of their stories that they're continuing. So when they get to that point, then we come back together again.
So do you do joint promotional activities as well as joint creative activities?
We've done a lot of joint promotional activities as well as, that was kind of a little while ago because, like I said, I kind of started getting ahead, and I know that some of them had other projects kind of jump in front. So we don't do a whole lot of joint promotional stuff at this moment, but it is always ready whenever it gets to that point.
And was there somebody who was sort of outlining the backstory that you described so that people who were reading in the different storylines that were going on, it would mesh up where it needed to mesh up and then work toward the Avengers scenario where people from the different worlds are starting to come together? Was there an architect like that? Were you the architect of that?
Well, I was not the architect of all of that. I was certainly the architect of some bits of that, but we would have these meetings every couple of weeks and talk about how the higher level characters are talking to each other from the various continents as we're building towards this. And then of course we had the Bible, the World Bible, where it sets out rules for magic. It sets out the timeline. It sets out all of these things that we have to adhere to. Like these are the rules. And it's pretty flexible aside from that, but those are the rules. Like if you've got magic, you've got the 5 paths to magic: line magic, love magic, lore magic, land magic, and life magic. Those were the 5 avenues to magic, and each one has a different way to use it and to utilize it. And so we had that to kind of keep us in contact. But then we made it a little bit more free-flowing in other ways. So for example, if I had something that I wanted to do in Daemonon, I would call up Quincy and say, hey, I want to do this in Daemonon. He's like, absolutely. In fact, one of my entire books takes place in Daemonon. One of my characters gets pulled through this magical portal called ELDROS into Daemonon, and she has a whole side adventure there that is integral to my story when she comes back to Noxanon. And he lent me some characters for that are not main characters, but side characters in his story that then could plug into his story. Did the same thing with Mark, where I included one of his immortal characters in the history. Somebody's like quoting history and brings up his main character's name, who is like this immortal guy, Aura Lightbringer. That's when Aura Lightbringer did this. It was just a little thing. It's just a little snippet of history, but it's part of the story, and it wraps his continent into my continent. So we did a lot of that kind of stuff.
It does seem nice that at least in these formative stages, you can each be working somewhat independently. I mean, you've described some sort of exception examples where you needed to coordinate, but then it will be interesting when you get to the point where you're writing stories that involve all the different characters from the different worlds, how the dynamic would change then.
Yes. And we tested the waters a little bit with that. So we had this interlude at the end of all of our books. And the interlude was the same situation told from 4 different perspectives, right? So you've got the same events, but it's coming from the perspective of my character in my book. And then you go to Quincy's book, and this interlude is from the perspective of his character. And my character might think that Quincy's character is this boorish idiot, and Quincy's character is like, aha, I've got her exactly where I want her. She thinks I'm a boorish idiot. You know what I mean? So these were the kinds of things that we talked about and shaped. And I imagine when we get to the Avengers book, that will be how we work it out, right? Like we sort of bring them together and just start feathering together these personalities in a way that everybody likes.
It does seem as if a certain amount of flexibility is good in this kind of collaboration, especially with that many people, because I imagine that if you had gone into it and said, every person has to write 5 books in their world within the next 5 years, and then at that point, we're going to bring it together, and then there's going to be an overarching story arc that's going to cover 12 books, and we'll put that out over the following 6 years, whatever it might be, that I think that would be a recipe for disaster because, first of all, it feels so overwhelming. And also, I think that as you're pointing out, just people's creativity runs in different schedules. And
Yes.
if you were, I'm guessing that you're not hovering over the other people who haven't put out quite as many books as you have and breathing down their necks about that. But having some flexibility there, I think, is super important when you're working in that kind of collaboration with other people.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And interesting that you say that because that was exactly how we structured it in the beginning, and it did not work. And we then sort of broke apart. So we broke apart the way that we had done it before and essentially made everybody in charge of their continents. Because in addition to this, we also invited other writers, which we called cohort writers, who were not founders and were not in charge of the meta plot, but they could write in the world. So essentially, they'd have to stay away from certain topics, or if they wanted to get into those certain topics, they had to work closely with the founding author of that continent and then write in Noxanon, or write in Daemonon, or write in Draconon, right? So they were able to do this. So what we did at one point, instead of having everything together as like all 4 of us had to make all the decisions about everything all the time, we split apart the structure of it, and each person is now in charge of their continent. And if somebody wants to write in that continent, essentially the boss is, if somebody wants to write in Noxanon, I'm the boss. And that's, you have to adhere to the Bible of the world, as well as whatever rules I put down as important, right? But one of the things, so we did have to move to a more flexible format. But you're right. I mean, we did that because we saw that that was the only way to make it happen, because people's creativity runs at different speeds. And that way, especially the way that I think we did a pretty good job, especially the way that I think we did a pretty good job of organizing it in the first place, where we originally said, let's do a book a year. We'll do this for 8 years in a row. After 5 books, we'll mesh the stories and do 3 more books with the stories meshed, right? And so that enabled us to do 2 things. One, we could write our entire story on our continent and not have to interact with the other characters at all, or we could interact as much as those characters wanted to interact with us. So it was really free-flowing. And then once we got to book 5, we could finish out our stories, which I did. Like, there is a whole meta plot story arc that is done. Like, you could buy the first 5 books of Legacy of Shadows, ELDROS Legacy. That's my series in Noxanon. And you don't have to read anything else. You would be completely happy with those stories. They are completely contained stories with some things that could go off into other worlds. But once they catch up and they start writing their other stories, we can also move forward, right? That's or at least some of the characters can move forward. And so that was a good way to structure it, because at this point, if it's 10 years down the road, that doesn't bother me. I got the story that I wanted to write. I'm done with that, and it can be that. And if they catch up to me and we decide we want to continue forward with that collaboration 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we can do that too. So yeah, the flexibility became really important.
And it does seem as if you also had the opportunity for sort of escape valve, because I never like to say get hit by a bus, but let's just say one of your collaborators wins the lottery and decides to move to a remote desert island and never write again.
Right. Yes.
And you could just have their world blow up or something like that. Like, there's probably a way to massage the plot so that even in that very traumatic situation, there would still be a way to move forward with the rest of the stories.
Finish it out. For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yep. One of the other things, something that came up to my mind that's a little bit off the current main topic, but still about collaboration and flexibility, is something that stuck with me about the way that we worked with each other, was that we always said, and this is more like, okay, somebody wants to do something, right? And rather than shutting them down and saying like, no, that's not what we're going to do, we did a really good job of keeping in mind the mantra of just say yes. If you can say yes, do say yes. So say one of my cohort authors is like, well, I'd like to bring out this creature called the World Breaker that is capable of destroying the entire world. And I was like, okay, well, we got the meta plot covered on like the world threatening thing. So here's what I'm going to say. Yes, you can have this creature that has the power to destroy the whole world, just as long as they don't. Like, you can't actually have them exercise that power. You can have the threat hanging over your group, but you can't shake the world or crack it down the middle, or, you know what I mean? Like, you can't do anything that's going to affect all the other characters. So you can have the threat loom large over your characters, but they got to resolve it and put that guy back in the box before he actually does any world destroying. So, I mean, you say yes as much as you can, because clearly you can't have a character that cracks the world in half and then everybody else has to deal with the cracked world that they weren't anticipating, right? You can't go that far, but you could talk about, well, he has the ability to crack the world in half. And if he gets to the top of that mountain with this stone in his mouth, then he'll crack the world in half. And you can have all of that galloping towards that big climax. You just got to make sure that your heroes get that stone out of his mouth or kill him or whatever before he makes it to the top of that mountain.
Yeah, I think that's good advice, not only in enormous epic collaborations, but just in business in general and interpersonal interactions in general.
Right.
And I also had a question about the cohort authors. How many of them are there, and how do you coordinate their involvement?
Well, let's see. I've got 2 with published books. We'll just talk about the ones that actually published books because there are some that are kind of working on books that haven't been published yet, but we'll just deal with the ones that actually came out. So we have 2 in Noxanon. There were 2 in Daemonon. There was 1 in Pyronon. And I know that Mark in Draconon, I don't think he ever had one that published, but I know he had 2 or 3 that were working on books in his. So that was like, they were kind of spread out. And like I said, we're Kendra, who's in my continent, and Becca, who's in my continent. They reported to me with all of their questions, and I helped them with whatever it is that they needed at the time. So that was how that ran. And then the other ones dealt with their authors and fit them in wherever they wanted to fit them in. And the sort of speech that we would give them is, you can be as involved with the characters, the main characters of the meta plot, or uninvolved with the main characters of the meta plot as you want. There are advantages to both. But if you are not involved with the characters, do whatever you want as long as it doesn't reshape the world. Like, we'll give you a little corner of the world and you can make it however you want. And in fact, they did. They each made different cities and things that I hadn't even created, right? I mean, they fleshed out certain areas of this entire continent that I had really not much to say about. But if you want to be involved with the main characters, that's also cool, but we got to stay in communication and make sure that it will fit. And there's actually some really cool interactions between Kyvan the Unkillable, who's like one of the main characters of my storyline, and some of the main characters of Kendra's world and Becca's world as well.
Are all of these books published under the same imprint, or is there any kind of like approvals? Like for someone writing in your world, you may not be talking with them every day, but you have to be able to read the book and give it the thumbs up at the end. How does that side of it work?
So yes, there is no central publishing. We are not a publisher. ELDROS Legacy went through a couple of iterations, but at this point, the way that it works is if you're self-published and you can publish your own book under your own auspices, then you could potentially be a cohort for ELDROS Legacy. The process would be wanting to do that in the first place, me thinking that it was a good idea. So let's say they were coming to Noxanon, and how Quincy and Marie and Mark work theirs is however they want to work it. As long as it doesn't break the world, as long as they adhere to the Bible, then that's not any of my business, right? So for me, it would be a writing sample. Like, they got to submit a writing sample to me, and their writing has to be good enough to where I would feel comfortable putting it out to my fans. Like, I mean, all the books that are in Noxanon, I am ecstatic to talk to my fans about them. Worldbreaker is a hell of a novel, and Kendra's entire trilogy, she wrote a trilogy, is amazing and award-winning. Like, she beat me for the award last year. It was my Noxanon book against her Noxanon book, and she took home the award. So that's
how funny.
That's how good and how proud of these stories I am, and how high quality they are. So so that would be the first step, is a writing sample. And then from there, it's like, okay, so when do you project to put it out? Which of the main characters do you want involved? So on and so forth. So it's kind of like next level fan fiction, probably, right? I mean, like they're not just fan fiction, they're actually writing in part of the world. So kind of like writing a Star Wars book under the Star Wars brand, right?
And do you coordinate things like book covers so they all have a similar look?
So these are the first two, my Legacy of Shadows. So as you can see, it's got that Thuros, that like frame around it, and that is the same every single time. The logo is the same, the Thuros is the same, and the only thing that changes even between continents is this symbol down here. That's the symbol of Noxanon. So if you see a book with that symbol, you know it's on my continent. The symbol will change. There's 5 of those symbols, and if it's got a different symbol, that means it's in Daemonon, or it's in Draconon, or Pyronon, or even Lathranon. So yes, they will all have a similar feel to them, even if the art is even a different style, right? You don't have to, we don't have the same artist for all of them. It would just be so much work for a single artist. All of mine are from the same artist. And actually, Becca's book, she contracted with Roshan, that's my artist, to do her book as well, which is a fantastic cover. But they all have that similar look. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I think it's a really nice balance of providing consistency, but not taking on the administrative burden or the logistical burden of trying to coordinate complete uniformity.
Exactly. I mean, trying to make so that the frame around those pictures does a good job of kind of making it all brand identifiable, and they get to use that. That's part of being a cohort author, is you get to use that frame, and then the art has to be good. Like, if they came to me with like a really crappy piece of art to put in the middle of the frame, then that would be just like the novel. Like, the novel has to be good enough to be an ELDROS novel, and the art has to be professional enough to be on the cover of an ELDROS book. That would be the only limitation.
Yeah. I'll wrap up our conversation by saying that in the next week or two, I'm going to be talking with Michael LeBron about co-authoring nonfiction, because Michael and I just put out a book called From Page to Platform, How to Succeed as an Author Speaker. So we've learned lots and lots of things about co-authoring. And as we were working on From Page to Platform, we had this idea that we could share what we were learning in a co-authored book about co-authoring. And when we were first starting out, we sort of toyed with the idea of covering both fiction and nonfiction. Michael has more co-authoring fiction experience. I've co-authored a short story with someone, so I have a little bit of co-authoring experience, but I don't think it's expandable to co-authoring a novel-length work or even series of works. So there's going to be a little theme here about collaboration, but I can tell that the considerations for fiction are so different than the considerations for nonfiction that I don't think the best practices of one would necessarily convert to the other. But maybe Michael and I need to co-author a piece of fiction so we can write the follow-up book about co-authoring fiction.
Yeah.
So, Todd, it is always so much fun to speak with you. And please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Oh, yeah. So toddfahnestock.com. That's the best place to find everything that I'm doing, from ebooks to audiobooks to printed material. So toddfahnestock.com. So that's TODDFAHNESTOCK.com. And then I go to a lot of cons. So if you've got a con in your town, you might check to see if I'm going to be there, because that's a great place to meet me and talk about story.
And if you're going to a con and you're going to be selling books, make sure to listen to episode 224, where Todd talks about the secrets of maximizing in-person sales. So
there you go.
Todd, it's been another lovely conversation. I'm sure I'll be having you back to talk about one of the other topics from Falling to Fly. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Todd. I was impressed with the approach he and his collaborators came up with to handle such a massive undertaking, providing flexibility for the creators, but within clearly defined parameters. What's the most rewarding or challenging collaboration you've ever been a part of? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.